In the shadow of the Nile Delta, where the river meets the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, a great empire once guarded its northernmost gate. For centuries, the city of Thonis-Heracleion stood as the mandatory port of entry for all Greek ships entering Egypt, a place of immense wealth, power, and sacred ritual. But as the centuries turned, the ground beneath this metropolis began to fail, and the sea claimed what the pharaohs had built. Today, the ruins lie 30 feet below the waves, a silent witness to the fragility of civilization and the unforgiving power of the shifting earth. Chapter 1. The Gateway of the Pharaohs, 8th century before Christ. Long before Alexandria was a blueprint in the mind of a conqueror, Thonis-Heracleion was the primary artery for the Egyptian state. Situated at the mouth of the canopic branch of the Nile, it was a city built on a network of canals, islands, and reclaimed land. This was not merely a residential center, but a strategic fortress designed to regulate the flow of trade and people into the heart of the kingdom. Every vessel that sought the riches of the Nile had to first clear the customs houses of this bustling port. The geography of the region was both its greatest strength and its ultimate weakness. The city sat upon a marshy landscape where the silt of the Nile had accumulated over millennia to form a delicate frontier between land and water. To the Egyptians, this was the edge of the world, a place where the fresh water of the river collided with the salt of the great green sea. The rulers of the 26th dynasty understood that to control this river, they had to control the mouth that fed it, the power. The economic machinery of the city was governed by strict royal decrees, as evidenced by the stela of Thonis-Heracleion. This massive black granite slab, discovered in the modern era, explicitly details the taxes and customs duties imposed by Pharaoh Nectanebo I. It was a place of immense bureaucratic precision, where scribes recorded every amphora of wine and every talent of silver that crossed the border. This was the lifeblood of the throne, funding the armies and the temples that maintained the Egyptian order against the rising pressures of the Mediterranean world. But why did this river mouth matter so much more than any other? Look at the map, and the strategic logic becomes clear. The canopic branch was the deepest and most navigable route into the interior of the delta. By centering their authority here, the pharaohs created a choke point that no merchant could bypass. It was a site of surveillance where the state could watch the horizon for both the sails of commerce and the hulls of war. Wealth. The city was also a place of deep religious significance, home to the great temple of Amun-Gareb. This was the site where the pharaohs came to receive the title of Universal Lord, a ceremony that linked the crown to the ancient gods of the Nile. The temple was a massive structure of stone, built with a heavy confidence that seemed to ignore the shifting silt beneath its foundations. It was a symbol of permanence in a landscape that was inherently fluid. Chapter 2. The Greek Nexus, 5th century before Christ. By the middle of the 5th century before Christ, the Greek historian Herodotus traveled to Egypt and recorded the presence of Thonis-Heracleion in his histories. He described a city that was not purely Egyptian, but a vibrant crossroads where Hellenic and Nilotic cultures merged. Greek merchants and mercenaries were a common sight in the streets, bringing with them new ideas, new weapons, and a hunger for Egyptian grain. The city had become a cosmopolitan hub, a place where the frontier was as much cultural as it was geographical. The presence of the Greeks was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated alliance by the Egyptian kings. They needed the naval expertise and military power of the Greeks to counter the looming threat of the Persian Empire to the east. Thonis-Heracleion was the site where this diplomacy took place, a neutral ground, where the interests of the Mediterranean and the Nile were negotiated. It was the premier marketplace for the exchange of silver, oil, and wine, for the exotic treasures of Africa. Trade. Inside the city, the infrastructure was designed to handle a massive volume of shipping. Archaeologists have discovered more than 60 shipwrecks in the waters around the city, the largest graveyard of ancient vessels ever found. These ships tell a story of a harbor that was constantly crowded, a place where the noise of the docks never ceased. The fleet was the city's shield, patrolling the sea and ensuring that the revenue continued to flow into the royal treasury. The architecture of the city reflected this maritime focus. Houses were built on stilts and stone platforms, connected by a series of bridges and ferries. To an observer of the time, it might have resembled a northern Venice, a city that lived in a constant dialogue with the water. The people of Thonis-Heracleion were masters of the marsh, turning a difficult landscape into a thriving center of global influence. So who actually controlled the frontier? While the pharaoh held the title, the reality of power in the city was a complex balance between royal officials, powerful priests, and wealthy Greek merchant families. This was a city that thrived on ambiguity, a place where one could find a temple to an Egyptian god, standing alongside a shrine to a Greek hero. It was this very flexibility that made the city indispensable to the survival of the Egyptian state during a period of imperial decline. Influence. Chapter 3. The Center of the Sacred. 3rd century before Christ. When the forces of Alexander the Great swept into Egypt, the balance of power shifted, but the importance of Thonis-Heracleion remained absolute. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, the city reached its zenith as a center of religious legitimacy. The Greek pharaohs, eager to prove their right to the throne, leaned heavily on the ancient rituals performed at the temple of Amun-Gereb. They understood that to rule the Nile, they had to be seen as the legitimate heirs of the pharaohs. The city became a stage for grand processions and festivals that drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. During the festival of Osiris, the Mysteries, a sacred boat traveled from the temple in Thonis to the neighboring city of Canopus. This was more than a ritual. It was a public display of the continuity of the Egyptian world. The water was the stage upon which the gods and the kings performed their duties to maintain the universe. Faith. The wealth of the temples was immense, supported by vast tracts of land and a percentage of the trade that passed through the harbor. This religious economy was the backbone of the city, providing stability, even as the political climate of the Ptolemaic Empire became increasingly volatile. The priests of Amun-Gereb were the keepers of memory, ensuring that the ancient traditions were preserved in a world that was rapidly changing. However, the very weight of this sacred architecture was creating a silent crisis. The massive stone pylons and colossal statues of the temple were exerting a tremendous amount of pressure on the water-saturated soil of the delta. For centuries, the ground had been stable enough to support the city, But the combination of construction and geological shifts was beginning to reach a breaking point. The ground was not as solid as the priests believed. What happens when an empire wins the battle for legitimacy, but loses the very ground upon which its symbols stand? In the 3rd century before Christ, the first signs of instability began to appear. Small floods became more frequent, and the canals began to silt up at an alarming rate. The city was still the jewel of the delta, but the foundations were starting to crack under the weight of its own glory. The high Gianmilanus, the decree of Canopus, a tripartite stela similar to the Rosetta Stone, provides a glimpse into the administration of this era. It speaks of a state that was highly organized, focused on the calendar, the gods, and the welfare of the people. But between the lines of these official proclamations, one can sense an increasing anxiety about the environment. The Nile was unpredictable, and the sea was encroaching. The city was trapped between a rising tide and a sinking shore. Chapter 4. Seismic shutters and liquid soil. 2nd century before Christ. In the 2nd century before Christ, the long-standing relationship between Thonis-Heracleion and the earth finally ruptured. A series of catastrophic events, likely triggered by a combination of earthquakes and severe flooding, struck the Nile Delta. The results were not merely destructive, they were transformative. The very soil beneath the city underwent a process known as liquefaction, where saturated silt loses its strength and behaves like a liquid. Imagine the terror of a city where the ground beneath your feet suddenly turns to water. Massive stone buildings, including parts of the Great Temple, did not just fall, they sank. The heavy masonry was pulled down into the soft mud, disappearing from view in a matter of hours. This was a catastrophe of biblical proportions, a moment where the geography of the city was rewritten by the force of the earth itself. Collapse. This was not a single event, but a cycle of destruction that would continue for centuries. Each major flood of the Nile brought more weight to the delta in the form of new silt, further destabilizing the fragile coastline. The city was being pulled into the abyss by the very river that had given it life. The inhabitants tried to rebuild, but the map they were working up from was no longer accurate. The harbor was changing, the canals were shifting, and the islands were disappearing. Historians and geologists now believe that a major earthquake in the Mediterranean triggered a tsunami that slammed into the Egyptian coast. Such a wave would have had a devastating effect on a city built just a few feet above sea level. The walls that had kept out foreign armies were useless against the sea. The human cost was likely staggering, with thousands swept away or buried beneath the rubble of their own homes. Ruin. But why did the city not simply relocate? The answer lies in the infrastructure and the sacred nature of the site. One does not simply move a gateway or a holy temple. The survivors clung to the ruins, attempting to maintain their way of life, even as the Mediterranean reclaimed the streets. It was a struggle of will against the inevitable, a slow retreat from a frontier that was no longer defensible. The economic impact of this collapse was immediate. Ships could no longer find safe anchorage in the shifting harbor, and the customs houses were buried underwater. The trade that had once defined Thonis-Heracleion began to migrate. to the nearby metropolis of Alexandria, which sat on more stable ground. The city was losing its purpose, its wealth, and its future. It was becoming a ghost of its former self, a relic of a dying era. Chapter 5. The Weight of Empire and Water, 1st century Anno Domini. By the time the Roman Empire annexed Egypt in the 1st century, Anno Domini, Thonis-Heracleion was a shadow of the power it had once been. The Romans, with their focus on efficiency and large-scale grain exports, saw Alexandria as the only port that mattered. The ancient gateway of the Pharaohs was now a secondary outpost, a place of memory rather than momentum. The Roman administration maintained a presence, but the investment in the city's infrastructure had largely dried up. The geography of the delta continued to fail. The Roman period saw a continued rise in relative sea levels, a phenomenon caused by the subsidence of the deltaic shelf. The city was sinking at a rate of several millimeters per year, a slow-motion disaster that was visible only over generations. The grand temples were now partially submerged, their sacred chambers filled with brine and sand. The gods of the Nile were being swallowed by the sea. Decay. This period raises a fundamental question about the lifespan of a civilization. Do we notice when the ground beneath us begins to give way, or do we adapt until the change is total? For the people of Thonis-Heracleion, the transition was a series of small concessions. A temple closed here, a road was abandoned there, a canal became too shallow for ships. The city did not die in a single day. It faded into the waves through a long process of neglect and geological inevitability. The Roman tax records from this era show a decrease in the revenue generated from the Canopic region. The population was migrating inland, seeking the safety of the higher ground. Those who remained were mostly fishermen, and those who still served the remaining shrines. The cosmopolitan elite that had once walked the streets of the Greek nexus were long gone, replaced by the quiet desperation of a community living on the edge of an abyss. Survival. As the Roman Empire itself began to fracture in the 3rd and 4th centuries Anno Domini, the maintenance of the delta became an impossible task. The dikes and dams that had once managed the flow of the river fell into disrepair. Without constant human intervention, the Nile reclaimed its freedom and the sea pushed further inland. The battle for Thonis-Heracleion was being lost, not to a foreign army, but to the lack of resources and the relentless pressure of the Mediterranean. What is the responsibility of a state to protect a city that nature has marked for destruction? This is a question that resonates even in our modern world. In the 4th century, a massive earthquake struck the eastern Mediterranean, followed by a tsunami that devastated the city of Alexandria. For the already weakened Thonis-Heracleion, this was a blow from which it could never recover. The remaining structures were shattered, and the sea began its final, permanent occupation of the ruins. Chapter 6. The Final Descent, 8th century Anno Domini. The final disappearance of Thonis-Heracleion occurred in the late 8th century Anno Domini. By this time, Egypt was under Islamic rule, and the capital had moved to Fustat, near modern-day Cairo. The canopic mouth of the Nile had largely been abandoned in favor of other branches of the river. The city, once the gateway of the Pharaohs, was now a cluster of half-submerged ruins and a few isolated communities clinging to the highest points of the sinking land. A massive flood of the Nile combined with a severe earthquake, finally tipped the balance. The remaining islands of the city were inundated, and the liquefaction of the soil reached its terminal stage. The earth literally gave way, and the last vestiges of the city, of Thonis-Heracleion, slid beneath the waves. In a single, catastrophic season, 1,000 years of history were erased from the surface of the world. Silence. The city vanished so completely that its very location was forgotten. For more than 1,000 years, it existed only in the pages of ancient texts and the legends of the Delta. It became a myth, a Mediterranean Atlantis that many historians believed was a figment of Herodotus's imagination. The maps of the Middle Ages showed nothing but an empty sea where a great metropolis had once stood. The water had kept its secret, well, burying the ruins under layers of sediment and silence. The disappearance of the city had a profound effect on the geography of the Nile Delta. With the collapse of the canopic mouth, the river was forced to find new outlets, reshaping the coastline and the ecology of the region. The trade routes that had once centered on this point were permanently redirected, leaving the area a desolate frontier of salt marshes and shipwrecks. The empire had lost its gate, and the sea had gained a kingdom. Memory. How does a city that was so vital to the economy of the ancient world simply disappear from the collective memory of mankind? The answer lies in the absolute nature of its destruction. There were no ruins left to see, no columns breaking the surface of the water. The loss was total, and as the centuries passed, the stories of Thonis-Heracleion were treated as moral fables about the pride of kings and the wrath of the gods. The truth was far more complex, a story of geology, climate, and the limits of human engineering. The silence lasted until the dawn of the 21st century. It was then that a team of underwater archaeologists, led by Frank Godot, used advanced technology to peer through the sediment of the seabed. What they found was a time capsule of an empire. Statues of pharaohs, massive stelas, gold jewelry, and hundreds of anchors lay exactly where they had fallen, over a millennium ago. The city was not gone. It was merely waiting to be rediscovered. Chapter 7. The Silence of 1,000 Years, Medieval to Modern Era. The rediscovery of Thonis-Heracleion in the year 2000. Anno Domini changed our understanding of the ancient world forever. The artifacts pulled from the sea are in a state of remarkable preservation, protected from the elements by the very silt that destroyed the city. We can now see the colossal statues that once stood before the great temple, their features still sharp, their authority still palpable. These are not just objects. They are the DNA of a lost civilization. The site is a vast underwater museum covering an area nearly 15 square kilometers. It tells the story of a city that was a bridge between worlds, a place where the Pharaohs and the Greeks built a shared future. The sheer volume of find, more than 700 different types of anchors and thousands of coins, proves that the city's wealth was even greater than the ancient sources suggested. It was a powerhouse of the Mediterranean, a site of constant activity, discovery. But the most important discovery was the context of the ruins. The way the buildings fell and the position of the artifacts confirmed the theory of soil liquefaction. The city did not just drown, it was swallowed by the earth. This scientific revelation provides a warning for our own time, as many of our modern megacities are built on similar deltaic landscapes. The fate of Thonis-Heracleion is a mirror held up to the following future of our own coastal frontiers. The city's legacy is a reminder that the map is never permanent. Borders shift, empires fall, and the very ground we stand on can be reclaimed by the sea. Thonis-Heracleion was a city of ambition, a place that believed it had mastered the water. But in the end, the river and the sea had the final word. The ruins remain, a haunting testament to the fragility of human achievement in the face of the Earth's immense power. As we look at the colossal head of a pharaoh being, lifted from the Mediterranean, we are forced to confront reality of our own history. The city of Thonis-Heracleion is no longer a myth, but a tangible, cold, stone reality. It serves as a reminder that the sea is a patient conqueror, and that every empire, no matter how powerful, must eventually reckon with the geography of its own survival. Legacy. Conclusion. The story of Thonis-Heracleion is more than a tale of a sunken city. It is a profound lesson in the relationship between civilization and the natural world. For 1,000 years, this Egyptian gateway stood as a symbol of imperial power, a center of trade that linked the riches of the Nile to the salt markets of the Mediterranean. It was a place of sacred ritual and bureaucratic precision, built with a confidence that seemed to defy the very elements it sought to control. But the shifting silt of the delta and the seismic volatility of the earth proved to be a force that no pharaoh could command. Today, the ruins of this great metropolis lie in the silence of the deep, a time capsule of a vanished world. The rediscovery of this city has provided us with an unprecedented window into the life of the late period and the Ptolemaic era, revealing a society that was complex, cosmopolitan, and deeply religious. It also serves as a stark warning about the vulnerability of our own coastal infrastructures in an era of rising seas and geological instability. The map of the world is not a finished document, but a work in progress, subject to the whims of the water and the movements of the earth. If you found this exploration of ancient geography and lost empire compelling, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these forgotten stories of human history to light. What do you believe was the most critical factor in the city's collapse? Was it a failure of engineering or an unavoidable geological destiny? Let us know in the comments below. The sea may have claimed the city of Thonis-Heracleion, but its story belongs to us all. Chapter 8. The Mediterranean Balance, Legacy and the Lessons of the Deep, 9th century Anno Domini to present. The disappearance of Thonis-Heracleion was not merely a local tragedy. It was a fundamental shift in the geopolitics of the ancient world. For over a millennium, the city had served as a vital counterweight to the rising powers of the north, a southern anchor for the trade and diplomacy of the Mediterranean. When the city finally slipped beneath the waves, the balance of power the region was permanently altered. Alexandria became the undisputed and solitary gateway to Egypt, concentrating immense wealth and influence in a single urban center. The loss of the canopic mouth meant that the river was no longer a network of frontiers, but a single, tightly controlled artery of the state. This concentration of power made the Egyptian state both more efficient and more vulnerable. Without the secondary ports and customs houses of the Delta, the crown was entirely dependent on the stability of a single city. The diverse communities of merchants and mercenaries that had once thrived in the business marshlands were forced to integrate into the Greco-Roman culture of the capital, leading to a loss of the cultural plurality that had defined the gateway of the Pharaohs. The city was gone, and with it, the unique identity of the point. Frontier was erased from the map of the world. Memory. In the modern era, the ruins of Thonis-Heracleion provide more than just artifacts. They offer a critical data set for understanding the relationship between human settlement and environmental change. The discovery of the city's complex drainage systems and reinforced foundations reveals an ancient society that was acutely aware of its own fragility. They fought a centuries-long battle against the rising tide, using every tool of engineering and sacred ritual at their disposal. The fact that they ultimately failed is a sobering reminder of the limits of human technology when faced with the slow, relentless power of the earth. The preservation of the site is now a matter of international concern, as the ruins are threatened by modern pollution and the continued erosion of the seabed. Underwater archaeologists must balance the need for discovery with the obligation to protect this submerged heritage. Each statue and stela recovered is a piece of a puzzle that explains how an empire manages its most critical borders. The lessons of the Delta are more relevant today than ever, as our own civilization grapples with the reality of shifting coastlines and the loss of inhabited land to the sea. Survival. How do we decide which parts of our history are worth saving when the geography itself is disappearing? The excavation of Thonis-Heracleion shows that even when a city is lost to the abyss, its influence continues to ripple through time. The wealth that passed through its harbor funded the monuments that we still admire today, and the ideas exchanged on its docks helped shape the foundations of Western thought. The city is no longer a place on a map, but it remains a vital chapter in the story of human ambition and the enduring power of the Nile. Conclusion. The journey through the history of Thonis-Heracleion brings us back to the central question of how an empire survives at the edge of the world. This was a city built on the promise of trade and the authority of the gods, a gateway that successfully managed the collision of cultures for over 1,000 years. Its collapse was not the result of a single mistake, but a slow accumulation of geological and environmental pressures that eventually reached a breaking point. The city did not lose its legitimacy or its wealth. It simply lost the ground that allowed it to exist. As the ruins remain 30 feet below the Mediterranean, they stand as a silent testament to the fragility of our greatest achievements. The gateway of the Pharaohs is a reminder that the map is a temporary document written in the sand and subject to the judgment of the sea. What remains is the legacy of a civilization that dared to build. At the frontier, a memory that has survived. The darkness of the deep to speak to us. In the present, we are the keepers of this history, tasked with learning the lessons of a city that the earth could no longer hold. If you found this cinematic journey into the depths of the Egyptian past insightful, please like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel for more long-form documentaries. Your engagement helps us continue to explore the hidden chapters of our collective story. What other lost cities or submerged empires should we investigate next? Let us know in the comments below. The story of Thonis-Heracleion is finished, but the history of the sea is just beginning to be told.